What do you know about politics? What should you know? Forget views, beliefs, and opinions. Politics is really a science, and that's where we come in. Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby.
I'm Todd Kent, and we're your guides to what's actually happening in politics. We're using our years of experience to navigate political data, media, money, behavior, and more to educate and inform you.
Welcome to Inside Political Science. I'm Kirby Goodell. I am the host today, not on my own. I have a fantastic guest, Brandon Rottinghaus, a professor from the University of Houston, one of the leading experts on Texas politics. I hope you don't mind me calling you that, Brandon.
I don't mind you calling me that for sure. That only means I'm old, I think.
My co-host, a frequent co-host, Todd Kent, is in Europe. He is with a group of students, and they are learning about European politics in the world. And so I know he would rather be here, but somehow I think he's doing okay. I'm really excited about this episode. One of the things that we wanted to talk about was the Texas Pulse Poll. This is a new initiative coming out of the Bush School. It's also with a survey research firm, Recon MR, and the Siena Institute. And together they have been running the New York Times polls on national politics. And they wanted to come here and do some Texas politics, and so we were able to form a partnership with them. This is part of a bigger initiative, and the bigger initiative is with my colleague Cliff Young, a former president at Ipsos. We're trying to create something called the Leadership and Foresight Lab, and the idea of foresight, and I think, Brandon, you'll appreciate this, and especially when we're talking about poll numbers, is we're not just reporting the numbers. We're trying to provide context and information around the numbers, because we know the cliche is that the polls are a snapshot. You have to have context in order to understand polls, and I think that's one of the challenges in terms of making sense of numbers. And so you're here in part as a leading expert on Texas politics to help us provide some context in terms of the polling.
Yeah, happy to. It's been a long time coming for Democrats, right? Since basically the 90s, since Jurassic Park was in theaters the very first time. It's a long time ago. Most of our students don't even remember those days and weren't even born.
Yeah, and so that's really sort of the first question is, since I've been in Texas, I came to Texas in 2014. Every single election cycle, it's like, this is the year Texas turns blue.
Right.
And then Texas is weirdly and stubbornly red. And it defies the prediction each and every time. Is this the year that Texas turns blue?
Of course, right? That's the narrative, right? You're certainly seeing Democrats here in Texas optimistic. You're seeing national Democrats willing to open up their wallets, which is really the telltale sign that there is something happening. So, to answer your question, I'm not sure. Obviously, there are lots of signs that point to yes for Democrats. They have been talking about the idea that demographic change is destiny in the state since the early 2000s, and it hasn't materialized, at least in terms of wins. But like you said, this is a unique state. It tends to be much more expensive than most states. It tends to be much larger to campaign in most states. I've worked in statewide races. I've worked in local races, and you just see a tremendous spread of the type of people who live in Texas. And although Democrats want to say that demographics change means that they're going to win, it's not a guarantee. The way that the messaging has worked, the way that the communications have worked, hasn't always landed for them. So I guess, to answer your question, we don't know. I, though, think for most Democrats that they're looking for moments, and this is one of those moments.
Yeah. So in some of the first set of polling numbers, maybe we can talk about to provide some context around this is we have Tallarico and Paxton essentially tied. No difference in between them in terms of who's winning or who's losing, and that's consistent with what we're seeing in some of the Real Clear Politics numbers. But when you move to all the other races, Republicans have an advantage. So they have an advantage in the governor's race. They have an advantage in the lieutenant governor's race. They have an advantage in the attorney general's race. They have an advantage on the general ballot question. So is this really about some big trend, or is this just about Tallarico and Paxton?
Yeah, I think it's mostly about Tallarico and Paxton. This has become a nationalized race, which has implications for how both candidates run. It's not a necessarily kind of boon for either. I think it has positives and negatives for both. We can talk about those, but I think you're right that this is really about the Senate race. The reason I think the numbers are as they are is that, in the reason that the Democrats are sort of trending below where Tallarico is that number one, he's got more of a national profile and there's kind of a halo effect. Number two, his favorables are slightly higher than most other Democrats. And number three, he's better known than most Democrats. Those things can all, well, as last two things can change. Actually, they can all change. The halo can definitely be plucked off of his head. We're certainly going to see Ken Paxton try to do that, and they've been trying to do that. So I think it was interesting to me, too, about the poll that you find essentially this is tied. It makes a lot of sense to me. This is going to be a real coin flip of a race. And I think that the reason it's so close and the reason it's changed from where things have been traditionally, you've seen kind of polls that have suggested that, Tallarico is slightly ahead. I think we've come back to reality now. And this is where all of a sudden Republicans and Democrats are both looking at this race with clear eyes, especially Republicans who say, okay, we don't want to get beat by James Tallarico. So they're starting to unify around Paxton when, during the primary that wasn't so obvious. So you're going to see a lot of changes here, I think, in those sort of metrics I talked about. And the Tallarico campaign is going to have to kind of figure out how to respond. This is like what Mike Tyson said about big game fights, right? Like everyone's got a plan until you get hit in the face. And so the Tallarico campaign's been hit in the face. The Paxton folks came out swinging. They threw all kinds of old stuff at the Tallarico folks, messaging that he's tried to do, some of the unusual things he said out of context. It might be concerning for some voters. I don't know if it'll stick or not. I don't know if they'll keep with it or not, but they've definitely landed a couple punches here, and I think you're seeing the numbers reflect that.
Well, the other thing that if you're looking sort of at the Paxton numbers, one of the things that surprised me at the poll was that Cornyn was actually not as well received as I thought he was. I thought when we compared sort of Paxton to Cornyn, we'd see that his favorability numbers were much more positive because he would have a better view among independents or a better, and he really isn't. Is this just what happens when you have a sort of nasty contested primary, that whoever comes out of that contested primary is bruised and beaten up and people are questioning whether they can win?
Definitely a lot of bruises coming out of that campaign, and no one was going to come out unscathed. There's no question about that. Now, that doesn't mean you can't heal up, and like between Rocky 1 and Rocky 2, right, both fighters have to kind of regroup, have to heal up, and then kind of figure out what the strategy is. So we'll see another round essentially happening. But I think that for at least the purposes of the poll, you're seeing that all incumbents are struggling, that there is a real sense, I think, among the people of Texas that they're unhappy about leadership in general. They don't see the kind of changes that they had hoped to be manifest in their pocketbooks and their communities. And that's, I think, a real liability for any elected official. And so John Cornyn may have had some advantages that, that Ken Paxton didn't, but at the end of the day, he's still been in office for 20 plus years. I think people looked at that and said, what have I got for it? Paxton materialized this, and I think was really able to connect people to say, like, especially Republicans who are, like not like the most committed Republicans, right? These are sort of rank and file folks who, want to sort of support the team, but don't necessarily, have a particular horse in that race. They decided to stay home. The numbers didn't lie on that, and Cornyn didn't do much to be able to convince them. So I do think that there's some of that. Underlying a lot of this actually is really interesting stuff too, and that is you're seeing for among the first time the people of Texas saying that the state and country are on the wrong track. That combined with the fact that you've got, kind of a sense that the national mood is in dire straits, the economy's sour, Trump's numbers are effectively underwater. These are all giving us a signal that, like, there's not really much quarter for Republicans. So they're going to have to make up some ground. They're going to have to convince people their brand is better than the Democrats' brand. That traditionally hasn't been that challenging, or at least it hasn't been successful for Democrats to be able to convince people like of the opposite. So Democrats are still kind of fighting uphill here, and Republicans are in a better shape to be able to convince voters that their brand is the one they should trust and stay with. But it's still tarnished in a way that could be really troublesome for a nominee like Ken Paxton, who's going to have to fight battles on multiple fronts.
Yeah, if I'm looking at the race and looking at the numbers a little bit, the one thing that seems to me necessary for Paxton to do is, one, he's got to pull in the people who are supporting Abbott and who are supporting a generic Republican who
Yeah.
who have doubts and hesitations about supporting him. And if he can do that, he's moved himself much closer to victory. And the other thing is he has to define Tallarico.
Yeah.
There's a 1 in 4 voters who don't have a opinion towards Tallarico, and that's a fairly high number, especially moving into a general election period. And you have to define that candidate. And so you're going to see, and I think we're already seeing this, and you mentioned it, there's going to be an onslaught against Tallarico, and you're seeing some questioning of, I think Ted Cruz today said something about if the wind blows, he falls down. He's not very manly. That they're trying to paint him as weird, as Tallarico, all that kind of stuff. So the question is, can he hold his ground when they're trying to define him, and can he define himself? And I think that's one of the keys to that race, right?
That's such a great point. Yeah. When I teach my campaigns course to my undergraduates, we have an exercise where we basically put our candidates in boxes, right? Like what you say about yourself and what your opponent's going to say about you, what your opponent says about themselves and what you're going to say about them. So you basically create this messaging box, and the exercise is useful because it does give you a sense of what to expect. And of course, these are going to be races that are very long. It feels like we've been talking about this race, Kirby, for like years. It's only been a few months, right? But realistically speaking, like we're still a long way from the finish line here. So lots are going to change, right? We're going to see the messaging migrate. We're going to see, kind of the money kind of come and go. So there are a lot of things we're going to have to kind of think through here. And I think you're right to look at the messaging here, because what Paxton starts with in terms of how he wants to tackle might not be what he ends with. The Texan public is very concerned about affordability. You see this repeated in almost every crosstab across all these different groups, that this is something that's really important to them, even among, say, groups where, Paxton's really far ahead. He's got, plus 13 or so with men, and that's where Republicans generally live, but their number one concern is affordability, and how can Paxton convince them that he's a better choice? That's really where the fight is going to be, and I think that has to then kind of move their messaging from Tallarico is weird, he's a vegan, he's either not manly enough or he's too manly, like he is having a relationship with staffers. It's like an unclear amount of kind of mix, but they're gonna have to switch from that at some point to say, like, we can actually do something for you. So when that transition comes, I think it'll be interesting to see kind of what groups are following him and what those numbers look like underneath the hood.
Yeah, when I was asked to comment on this previously, one of the analogies I used is, if we think of this as a poker hand, Democrats have the best poker hand they have had in 3 decades, right? They have a pretty strong candidate. They're running against a candidate that has some flaws and has some negatives. They should be running with a strong wind helping them. It's a midterm election year of Donald Trump, whose an approval rating is not great. You mentioned the affordability issue. The affordability issue is driving people's concerns. So the economics, the politics, everything suggests this should be a pretty good Democratic year. And then you have a fairly strong candidate who's going to be well funded against a candidate who has some negatives going into the race. Is that a fair analogy? I mean, that doesn't mean they win, right? Republicans can still draw a better hand, but
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I like your poker analogy because it also connects to how much money you have, right? You can be a good poker player, but if you don't have the bankroll to back it up in the key moments where you've got to go all in or you've got to bluff a little bit, then it doesn't do you much good. And they're going to have the money. I think that's key. And I also think, this is an aside, but like the way that other campaigns that are Senate campaigns are imploding or struggling across the country may benefit Tallarico. So Graham Plattner's kind of struggles there may transfer potentially to the kind of positive effect for Tallarico. Plattner's raised like $16 million primarily from small donors. If it's the case that they abandon him with his campaign kind of struggling, then perhaps Tallarico benefits. Iowa, North Carolina, places where Trump has run strong. Democrats are hoping, and they've got good candidates, but it's still a long battle. And, like we said, this is going to be an extended kind of campaign period. So it's possible Tallarico gets, kind of some of the benefit of that, assuming all else stays equal, and that we don't know. The other poker analogy, I think, is whether or not your poker face is good. And for Democrats, their poker face hasn't been that good. They basically told everybody what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, and or there's kind of internal dissent among Democrats about what exactly to do. Tallarico still has ground to make up in terms of where the coalition is. Yeah. This is a coalition in Texas that relies upon black voters, younger voters, college-educated voters. Those numbers are good in the poll for him, but they're not great. The Latino voters in particular, which I'd love to get into as well, split for him in a good way that's pretty traditional for Democrats historically, but is not the kind of overwhelming amount that he'll need to be able to win in November.
Yeah, so if on the one hand, if we want to say, well, maybe this looks like the tide is turning and Texas is finally changing, but then you say, well, it's just really seems to be this one race. This one race really seems to be different than the others, even though, and maybe before we go there, let me just get you, were the other races, did they seem a little closer than it's basically +6? And are those a little closer than you would expect, given Abbott, given the congressional ballot? Or is that about what you would have expected in those numbers?
You know, it seems to me that's pretty similar to where the polling estimates for a top of the ticket race that's competitive. So like this happened in 18 too. Yeah. Most polls didn't frankly look for O'Rourke as good as this until the very end. Right. And so the fact that Tallarico can look at this and say, hey, there's some positives here is a good thing for him internally, but also just to be able to convince funders nationally that this is a real thing. So that's like a good thing for him. But down ballot, the same thing happened to the Democrats in 18. It was kind of a rising tide lifting all boats scenario. So I think you're seeing a kind of similar spread there. A little bit surprising in that the numbers are pretty favorable for Democrats. Like Jeannie Hinojosa is not well known outside of Austin, and the fact that she's within 6 points of the incumbent governor, who really like is the Republican Party in Texas, is a bit surprising. So those numbers are hard, and I think as time goes on, but it's a pretty, I think, good outcome for them. The other thing to note is that a lot of what's going on in what happened in 18 was that it wasn't so much kind of top down that was really driving Democratic enthusiasm. It was also bottom up. You had like 3 and 4 competitive races in 18 where there was a lot of enthusiasm down ballot. So you can point to some races here in Texas, like in 15, Bobby Pulido is like running, and that's a good opportunity for Democrats to be able to kind of juice up turnout. So the more of those sorts of races happening down ballot, the more that like the top of the ticket benefits. So the kind of relationship goes both ways.
Yeah. And do you expect, I mean, so flipping that around, and you've already hit at this a little bit, but I just want to make the point clear, is that, so one of the things O'Rourke seemed to do one, he never started out this well. He was much further behind at this point during the campaign season, and so it wasn't until he got momentum, and it was the whole idea that we're going to win by turning out voters, and started to mobilize people and get people excited. But one of the things that did is it really did help Democrats down ballot as well, and you're talking about the down ballot effects, the coming from the ground up as well. But we would expect to see that some from Tallarico, right? Even if he doesn't win, if he's close, if he mobilizes people, it could help the Democrats in some of the Texas Senate and House races.
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, if you look at the targets for Democrats, there aren't a lot of them at the federal level. They may be competitive in a handful. Like I said, 15 is possibly a pickup, but they definitely hold some races that were in jeopardy of being lost. So, basically fighting the other team to a draw is a pretty good outcome for Democrats at this point. And they're probably going to do that in South Texas, especially, in a moment where 2 years ago it looked like, Latino vote was going to shift permanently to the Republicans, right? I think what we're seeing now is that was much more of an aberration than a kind of real durable change. But I do think that if you look at the targets for like the Texas House, that there are several of those targets where it's possible that they could pick up some seats. Now, the way the districts are drawn is tough for Democrats to pick up a lot of seats, so it's not going to be like a tremendous change. But look, if they pick up 3 or 4 seats, that's enough to be able to symbolically say that they've been able to make some progress, and that can have a material advantage when it comes to the next legislative session. So I think, like I said, I think the relationship goes both ways, from top down and from bottom up, but it really does all kind of hinge on what Tallarico does, which is a lot to put on the shoulders of, a 30 something, second term member of the Texas House, right? Most of whom no one knows. Like, you couldn't name more than 3 other members of the Texas House of that generation. So you're seeing, I think, a real kind of shift in terms of how Democrats are seeing themselves, how they're seeing their candidates unfold, and where you see the kind of party migrating to. You don't have a lot of moderates left. Now it's like a lot of, very progressive candidates running, and that has potential because Democrats are going to rally behind that. But in a base versus base election, that's good. But it's also problematic because if you're really progressive like Tallarico, you say some things that maybe seem a little bit far afield for moderates who say, I don't like that, I'm worried about that.
Yeah. Well, let's pause right there. It's time to take a break. But you're hitting on some of the really key themes, because if Democrats have to worry about whether this race is unique and they're not really competitive statewide in the other races, some of the numbers about young voters, about changing demographics may play in their favor. So when we come back, we'll talk about demographics.
Howdy, this is Stephen Brugerhoff, your host of Garden Success, a weekly garden show featuring advice and ideas to help you grow a bountiful garden and a beautiful landscape. So join me for Garden Success every Thursday at noon here on Aggieland's Public Radio, KAMU FM 90.9.
Want to keep up with KMU Studios? Join us on our socials. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads for exclusive content, station news, special previews of popular shows and podcasts, behind-the-scenes looks, and upcoming community events. Get social with us. Follow us on Facebook by searching KMU Public Broadcasting, or on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads at KMU TV FM.
Welcome back to Inside Political Science. I'm talking to Brandon Rottinghaus, a professor at the University of Houston, a leading expert on Texas politics, and we're talking about the Texas Pulse Poll. One of the things that we were talking about is when we look across the races and we see that Tallarico looks like that's the most competitive of the race. That's the chance for Democrats to win their first statewide race in 3 decades.
Yep.
And so you sort of look at that and you say, well, maybe the hype about whether Texas is turning blue is overstated. But then when you sort of dig into the numbers a little bit more, you do see some evidence that Democrats should be at least a little hopeful, but it's some of the same evidence we've been talking about for a long time about whether Texas is turning blue. Younger voters are more Democratic. We see a huge gender gap. There is some evidence of Latino voters, but we need to be really cautious about them, because I think from what I'm seeing in this poll, they're the most interesting group and the most fascinating group, where I'm not really sure what to make of Latino voters in this. But let's start with the younger voters. It looks like younger voters more strongly not as strongly supportive of Trump, not as Republican as every other group of voter.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that's kind of the opposite of where things were in 2024. Democrats did not have a good year in a presidential where it was expected that they would, and the underperforming there really did create some liabilities, obviously all across the country, but certainly that's true in Texas. Colin Allred ran ahead of Harris on several of these key demographics, including younger voters, but not by much and not by enough for it to really matter. So it just kind of fell a bit flat. Tallarico's perhaps different. I mean, his generational profile is an asset in a way that it hasn't been for other candidates. And so that's a real plus. And like I said before the break, I mean, I think Democrats are rethinking whom they want to be in the kind of way that they want to evolve as a party. So this gives them a chance to be able to do that. Even if Tallarico doesn't win, it's still a real sea change in terms of kind of how the party sees itself. And that's been really different. Traditionally, the party hasn't embraced its more kind of extremist versions. And so this is kind of a new moment for Democrats, and whether it's kind of permanent or not, we'll see. But Tallarico certainly has a style that's aligned with where younger voters are. His profile is that of a kind of, younger reformer. He's been on social media and doing things that are, what most Democrats haven't done so far to create a national profile. That's the reason he's here. Right? I don't want to say Joe Rogan made this happen, but to some degree, that profile, gave him that boost. And so it just kind of became this sort of foregone conclusion. Now, that fight between he and Jasmine Crockett was, I think, really critical and did open up some wounds in the party. But for younger voters, they're looking for essentially this. I think that, her numbers would be similarly good as his in this. And so I don't think there'd be like a major difference right now, though they both have, brought different kind of characteristics to the office and to the job. But in this case, they're both, I think, in good shape, and Democrats are rebounding from where things were in 21 or 24. And so, Tallarico is ahead by a significant enough margin that this really does show that younger people are going to side with him. The problem is, as you know, Kirby, that they don't vote.
That was my, you took away my next question, because it was, he's got their support. Are they going to turn out for him?
That's the biggest question. And I think, the campaign has been effective at communicating to those voters, but getting to vote is a totally different measure. No, Beto O'Rourke had a great turnout machine in 18 that did propel him towards a very close race, but it ultimately just ran out of time. You probably heard this before, but a lot of candidates say it's not that I got beat, it's that I ran out of time. Like, well, there's a reason there's a shot clock, right? It's just like, there has to be some way to end this. No one wants to talk about campaigns forever. But I think for him, at least, there was the case that if there's a couple more weeks, then things would have been perhaps very different. So at this point, I think Tallarico knows that, and they want to make sure they're getting people out to vote. And that means younger voters, but that's been historically really hard. It's hard to know how that'll play out. I mean, every cycle seems like it's the sort of cycle for the youth vote, but those numbers don't always materialize. So we'll see. Texas is also becoming much younger, and so a bigger share of the electorate is younger. There's a way to communicate to those folks, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of money. Doing evaluation work for various groups here in Houston and in other places across the state, what we're finding basically is that it takes multiple touches, like multiple forms of communication to get to voters before they really come out to vote. These are like low propensity, often young voters. So you're moving the needle by a very little bit with a lot of effort. Campaigns aren't designed for that. They're short term, they're like pop-up businesses, right? They basically don't have the capacity to say, over the course of the next 4 cycles, we're going to talk to voters, 7-8 times. It doesn't really work that way. And that's a problem for Democrats, not having a kind of infrastructure. So it's a long way of saying, to your point about voters, then, whether they turn out or not, we just don't know. It's too expensive for most campaigns to kind of manufacture that, and there's not enough time for that to happen anyway.
And one of the lessons I took from the 2018 O'Rourke campaign is, while he was incredibly successful at turning out his voters, he also was incredibly successful in turning out Republican voters. And so it's not just that if he got enough votes to win under a normal election midterm cycle, but there were more votes, and he also mobilized the opposition. And in this case, Paxton's going to be working to mobilize Republican voters and to counter-mobilize, but Tallarico himself and his messaging and the way that what he does and what he needs to do to turn out younger voters may also engage and turn out voters who are less supportive.
That's exactly right. And the biggest liability that Tallarico has, the reason Paxton is trying to make this a partisan race is because that's the strategy Democrats have lost under for decades. So that's the reason Republicans are still effective, is because their base turns out to vote. If you look at the vote, if you look at the vote turnout rate for rural voters versus urban voters, in 24, rural voters were outvoting the urban voters as a percentage, not as a total, because there are more people who live in urban areas, but as a percentage of the vote, they're winning on that, and those are primarily Republican voters. So that's the strategy that Paxton's taking right now. The assumption that they're making is that this is a base versus base election. It's like a presidential election, and to some degree, I think that's a fair assessment. But for Tallarico, you need to steer that in a slightly different direction. You can't rely just on your base to come out to vote, because number one, historically, that's not been successful for Democrats, especially because they're a bit divided at the moment. And number two is that you still have not enough Democrats to support you. That if it's just a heads up battle, red versus blue, then Democrats are not going to win that fight.
Yeah, and we like to talk about sort of campaigns that are directed at median voters versus base campaigns that are and there really is that trade-off, right? The things that you do that really excite your base might lose you the independent voter. And Tallarico right now has some advantages among the independent voters, but they aren't huge, and that doesn't mean they hold, and especially if it looks like if they're successful in painting him as a weird leftist, he can lose those voters, right? And so the challenge is, how do you really engage that young voter, make sure that they're coming out, make sure that they want to participate, make sure that they're enthusiastic about your campaign, while also sending the message to that sort of more moderate independent voter who's less partisan that, hey, we also want you too, and we're not ideologically extreme.
Yeah, and that's what I think was successful for O'Rourke. He didn't have ideology that was so cemented that people couldn't see something in him. There's a bit of a Rockshot test like that. People could see what they wanted for a while, and then eventually that starts to harden. But I think for Tallarico, part of the reason that Paxton wants to cement this pretty early as a partisan fight is that he knows that he can use that as a kind of wedge to get voters to think that he's not the right choice. What's happening, I think, for Tallarico is good in this poll, in that there is a lot of evidence to suggest that people are unhappy with where the current state of politics is and the current state of the economy. So for Tallarico, if he can lean into some of these questions about the kind of affordability issue, and for younger people, quality of life issue, it's not just about how much money you have, it's also about how you can kind of live your life effectively as a kind of environmental concern or mobility concerns for local kind of urban areas. So there's a lot of things that I think, Tallarico can tap into that, although it may look like they're leftist if you asked people polling wise, right? Like, whether this is a left or a right idea or one that's supported by Republicans or Democrats, it would be, I think, still the case that people would look at that and say, yeah, maybe it's time to have a minimum wage increase, or yeah, maybe we should put limits on where data centers can go because of the environmental impact. Some of that cross-cutting political storyline could be where Tallarico gets the biggest kind of purchase for his strategy.
Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned, and I think this is a really interesting point, is national versus state politics, and sort of this tension between the two, because people are. There's a lot of evidence of dissatisfaction. There's some evidence of dissatisfaction at the state level, but it's not nearly as high as the dissatisfaction with national politics. And so people are, maybe they're not perfectly happy with what's going on in Texas, but they're way happier with what's going on in Texas than what's going on nationally, and they're way, and so there's that dynamic. Can you make this, so Republicans kind of want to make this about Texas, right, instead of national politics?
I think that's right. Yeah. And if they do, then they're likely to be successful. Texas, since the 2000s and really since Republicans started winning elections, has been better off financially than the rest of the country. Not always a lot, but always by a little. And, in terms of unemployment, in terms of wages, in terms of, kind of just general kind of quality of life and affordability things, we've always been slightly better. But that's changing. And it's clear that that's affecting people's pocketbooks. So there's definitely a window for a Democrat to be able to come in and say, look, this isn't being handled properly. And I think that the one additional liability is that, again, if you make this a national race, it's really kind of red versus blue. And if you play that game ideologically, then you're missing the opportunity to pick up voters who don't care about any of that, right? They're not team red or team blue. They vote on presidential elections because they're reminded to 1,000 times, right? They have an ideological axe to grind, right? They legitimately want to do their civic duty. Now, they don't always come out in midterms, so that'll be the real trick for Tallarico, but this isn't shaping up to be a normal midterm, right? Just like 18, this will be a pretty high turnout midterm. So that's, I think, a plus for Tallarico. But yes, the national mood is really bad. And so it gives Democrats a chance to be able to talk to more people to say, look, Republicans have their chance and they blew it. They didn't do a good job. The other thing is that, Ken Paxton is not a great messenger. He's not a great campaigner. And I think we'll see that out a bit more. Their first thrust of this is not going to be Ken Paxton in front of the camera. It's just going to be how much James Tallarico is a problem, or how he's weird, or all the other things that they'll say about him. The other issue is that, like you said, from kind of national storyline down, Donald Trump's messaging on the economy has been really bad.
Yeah.
Like, he's not able to convince people he's doing a good job on that. And there are some bright spots. Like, if you're invested in the stock market, you're doing really well. And if you're in certain kind of sectors of the economy, you're doing really well. But like, a lot of people are still suffering. And Trump's messaging has been really, I think, orthogonal to a lot of those concerns. And that's a real problem for every Republican down ballot, including Ken Paxton.
Yeah, and he said point blank, I don't care about the midterms. And that's kind of
you
surprising
have to care.
for a president to say. But one of the questions that I hate to get about polls, and I'm not going to ask you this directly anyway, you can answer it if you want, but kind of what's the most surprising result? And so, one of the things was just how dominant affordability was an issue, and how dominant it was across groups. I don't think I was terribly surprised about that. And speaking of Trump, he says affordability is not a word, they just made it up. But affordability is a concern, right? And it's a driving concern of voters. And when voters are unhappy about their pocketbook, that tends to come out in the polling place at some level, and usually against the president's party.
That's right. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And as you note, this is a moment where the president's party tends to lose seats. Some of that's just natural because of the political churn and dissatisfaction. But this case, it's really specific to the economy. So that was a huge finding, I think, and really across all groups. It's a real liability for Republicans. Now what's also interesting, and is obviously as sort of political scientists, we think about these issues not just in terms of current elections, but also kind of how trends over time have changed. And one of the things we've seen is that, number one, approval ratings tend to be highly correlated with partisanship, and number two, success and approval of the economy tends to be the same. So people have their blinders on when it comes to their preferences about the economy, and they could convince themselves that the current incumbent is doing great, and even if maybe they're not, and objectively that's not correct. So there's a lot of partisanship that's built into all of this. That's why I think, as you said, when you see these numbers stick out to say, like, this is something people are really unhappy about and really want voters really want candidates to focus on, just makes that more kind of pronounced.
Yeah. And the other sort of thing that really pops out when you look at the crosstabs is everything is driven by partisanship. I don't think we're surprised by that, though.
Right.
But sometimes when you're looking at it, you're like, wait, 96% of Democrats? 94%?
Why don't we just have the election tomorrow?
And so you look at the partisanship, and then you look at things like the gender gap on some of these numbers and some of the other things related to partisanship and connected to partisanship, and you say, maybe at one point we would argue that would we still argue that Texas is unique from sort of national politics, or are we just now a microcosm of the partisan polarization that is everywhere else, other than that we do lean Republican?
Yeah, that's such a great point. I've said this for years. There's no more Texas politics. It's all national politics. I think both parties treat it that way. All the candidates treat it that way. The voters increasingly treat it that way. We can measure this a bunch of ways, but I think we don't have to have experts like you polling to be able to understand that partisanship is really the kind of core of so much of what's going on here. So yeah, I think that's driving a lot of this decision making. And to some degree, it's a problem because for Democrats, they're forced to deal with and respond to what's happening to the National Democratic Party. Now, I'll preface this by saying that, all the pox has been put on both parties, and no one likes either party, right? And that's I think a problem for the partisanship and for democracy, frankly. But at the very outset of it, no one is getting out of this unscathed, where people say we really like one party or the other. They may vote for one candidate or another, but at the end of the day, the party's brands are both damaged. And so that's, I think, a real liability, but especially for the Democrats who have to, basically defend every kind of outrageous, partisan, kind of progressive decision that is discussed about anything in California at the local level, where things are very liberal, right? Now that's true for Republicans too, where they have to defend some more outrageous comments arguments that get made by, candidates all across the country, but it's, I think, more problematic for Democrats because in a place like Texas, it's still right-leaning, it's still independent, right, left of center, still right of center. So I do think that that's a real problem for Democrats when races get nationalized.
Yeah, the one thing we really haven't hit on that we got to hit on before we're starting to run out of time is the Latino voters.
Yes,
Such
a major factor.
We read all this stuff about Latino voters going to Trump, and then we thought they were swinging back. The evidence here just isn't overwhelming either way. And I don't know what you read on, but I've sort of felt like I'm not seeing the big swing back. I'm not seeing the big Republican support. They're kind of in the middle.
Yep. That's traditionally where they've been. The Latino population and the Latino voters have historically been the biggest swing vote in the state. They still are that way. It's just traditionally they aren't voting in big enough numbers to sway elections, and they're not cutting any one party in big enough numbers to sway elections. In the 1970s, you had a real split between the Latino vote and Democrats. That became institutionally motivated, and it's been hard for Democrats to kind of heal those wounds ever since. It's not like it is in California, where I've worked in politics there, and you're getting 80% Latino vote. That doesn't happen in Texas. If it did, Democrats would win elections every time. There wouldn't be a contest. So when the Republicans were getting a larger share of Latino vote, the kind of storyline was game over for Democrats. You can't win Texas if you can't win Latinos. But like you said, the numbers now kind of have bounced back and look more normal like they tend to. So Tallarico's got, +7, +8, which is basically where he and Democrats traditionally have been. But Latinos are not behaving like a solidly Republican constituency the way that it was presumed that they would, and the way that the Republicans drew district lines to kind of reflect and hopefully harness, right? Yeah. So part of the reason why the lines got redrawn was under that premise. I don't think that's going to happen.
So what's the one, we're starting to run out of time. What's the one thing that you're watching that you wish other people would pay attention to?
Yeah, it's a great question. One thing that Tallarico has to do is unify the Democrats, because I think no matter how you interpret what's going on, there's still going to be a serious base versus base quality to this election, and Democrats have to get back unified. After the fight with Jasmine Crockett, there's a lot of distrust. That has to be fixed. So I was looking at the numbers for black voters in Tallarico. He's winning by a healthy margin, 68-11, which is pretty good. So there's an opportunity there for turnout to be higher. They're a cornerstone of the Democratic Party everywhere, but especially in Texas. Those numbers have to be there or better to be able to be successful for Democrats. So that's what I've been watching. And I think the next couple of polls will kind of tell us what that trend looks like. And it'll come back to earth, but it's really then about turnout. Are you going to get the voters who support you to come out to vote? And is that going to be sufficient? That's the hardest thing. There aren't many persuadable voters anymore. It's sad to say, right? Most people are pretty much already committed, as you noted earlier, to the team that they like. So, that's really the puzzle for campaigns, is like, how do you reach that 5 to 10% of soft voters who are in the middle ideologically, who typically don't vote, who don't pay attention to politics? How do you get them to come vote for you?
Yeah, well, I'm going to let that be the last word. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us. If you're looking for the results, you should be able to find the Texas Pulse poll results online. And thank you for listening and watching Inside Political Science.
Inside Political Science is a production from KAMU, Aggieland's Public Television and Radio. For more information, visit tx.ag/InsidePoliticalScience. Have a question for our experts? Email them at InsidePoliSci@tamu.edu. Also, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss a new episode.